record on this computer. There we go. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. And we're continuing with our series as we think about practical neighborhood outreach and community engagement. And I'm really happy to have the Reverend John Crane, or Jonathan Crane, sharing with me today. John and I have known each other for a very long time, and he's currently serving as the rector of St. Augustine's in Edmonton. John, welcome to our little show.
Really glad to be here. And hello to everyone who will be watching.
So tell us a little bit about the history of community engagement at St. Augustine's, John.
Sure. So the reason I think sort of a history is a good place to start is I think more than some churches with a longer history, St. Augustine's has a pretty embedded history within the local community. So the church began in 57, and that was just as this area was beginning. It used to be a dairy farm, and then they developed it, and St. Augustine's began maybe like many churches did in the beginning. The bishop said, there's a new neighborhood starting, and who do we know that's out there? And so Jim and Sheila knew. We're part of the Anglican Young People's Group, and quite active, which was the sort of diocesan youth group at the time. And they were contacted, and the church began in their basement. So Jim fashioned an altar, and they did Sunday school in the neighbor's house beside. I think there are 3 or 4 houses right connected that they began doing different church activities in. And then pretty soon they were big enough to go to the school. They had actually gone to every house in the district and sort of organized people and invited them to be part of church. And yeah, then they began worshiping in the school, built a small building. I think at the time, as best I can understand, the city was actually allotting land for churches. So something I looking at the map around St. Augustine's when I was arriving, I was thinking, gosh, like we are literally at the center of this community. In sort of an older tradition, the community league is right across the street. There's a spray park and the sand park. What used to be the local elementary school, although it's community space now, as many post-war schools are now becoming. But literally the church ended up at this very central location. We have a little chunk of land here, bigger than we actually need for the church space, some green space. And so that was kind of from the beginning, and very naturally, people that came to St. Augustine's were connected in the church. So there's talk of Sunday school being 300 people, and you know, I would say of kind of the core founders generation, and still a lot of the people who have continued coming and started coming to St. Augustine's, around 60% are in this community and walk to church, and or used to be able to walk to church until they sold their house. And unfortunately, there's no not a great seniors housing around here, so we have a number in Millwoods or Sherwood Park who have had to move out for different times, but that sort of embedded nature of things sort of as a foundation here. And I don't know, there was a rectory for a time, so I know clergy lived here. There have been a number who lived a bit farther out, but I think most have had a sense of kind of embedded place in the community, which was a point of resonance for me. So maybe I can say a bit about my thinking as I come to this, and what formed me. Because yeah, I think that kind of fed into things. When I was serving at Holy Trinity, I was both realizing that my curacy was coming to an end, but also feeling a draw to community-based ministry and with some twists. And I was just mentioning before this video, a shift for me from sort of community outreach to community presence. And a big person for that in me was Howard Lawrence. So some of you might know him. He is involved at the city level with the Abundant Communities Initiative. He's actually been hired by the city. But before he was hired, he was just kind of doing his own work in actually the Highlands community, which is right across the river. He used to be a Baptist pastor, I think connected at Central Baptist. And then, I don't know his story exactly, but he ended up making the shift from the body of Christ meeting on Sunday to this sense of the body of Christ active in a place in between that. So he came to actually say pretty strongly in himself, and heard him speak about this, that, you know, go wherever you go on Sunday, where you live is where God is perhaps most active through you. And this sense that all these people go away to different places on Sunday, and that's the story here. We, in this community, people go all over the city for church. But the fact is that, you know, Monday to Saturday, we're here and we're living our lives, and we're engaging with neighbors, and not in kind of a programmatic way, but just a living life kind of way. We're here. And that was a big shift for me. It kind of connected a few pieces for me when I heard him talking about that. And he was, you know, he's quite challenging in how he speaks about that. And he had actually kind of begun a local church, even not quite a church plant, but a gathering within his neighborhood. And beyond just kind of doing church, a more general care for the spiritual health of the neighborhood and how that works. And enter the Anglican world. And Tim, as you well know, it's a mixed history, but we have the parish system in our history. And I don't know how it's been in your experience in Canada, but certainly mine is that we've kind of shifted to a commuter style church. I know a church I went to for a bulk of my teenage years. We drove a fair bit there. We actually started going to our neighborhood church where I grew up, but then, you know, because they had a better youth group, we ended up going here. I still think that was a great move from my parents. I don't know if I'd still be around if they hadn't made that move. But nevertheless, we were commuting, and people came from all over the city to that church. And but this growing sense of, gosh, there's something about the geographic area that is important. And in the Anglican world, we have actually a deep practice of that. Again, it's mixed, and I hear mixed reviews in England and Scotland where it's still the practice, largely structurally, of the parish church and the community around it, and this sense of whether or not you are a tithing member of the church or you've been baptized and confirmed, there's a sense of connection to this place and to the ministry that comes from that. So these are thoughts I was playing around with, and sort of what would it look like to reclaim that in a new way, and maybe live in that system. I would add into that Wendell Berry. I don't know if you've read much of him, Tim, but he became really important for Megan and I. And we were having a lot of conversations about what it means to live locally. He's a farmer in Kentucky, if you don't know him, and he sort of adds to the local nature this kind of generational sense in a lot of his fiction and his nonfiction. He has a strong he has a strong sense of the local community, you know, that knows one another and cares for one another and knows the land and has lived on the land generationally, caring for the land for future generations, and that sort of national structure even is just linking those local places. And he has sharp critique about sort of extractive processes and how when we care for the land, we are caring for ourselves and we are part of the land, and all these kinds of things that for me blend both ecologically and in sort of the Aboriginal history that we encounter. So, but that strong sense of local that he brings in, and living together in our frailty and vulnerability. So coming to St. Augustine's, Megan and I were already kind of thinking about some of this. And we wanted to live within walking distance, you know, to save car time and that sense of being connected in the community. We were thinking about these kinds of things. And then the house that was, I want to say, kind of given to us is directly across the street from the church. So we felt like it was God saying, and this is where you're going to fool around with this and figure out what this is about. The common story where, you know, we had a list of what we need.
I've lost you, John.
Did I freeze up?
Oh no, you're back. Okay, I lost your voice for a minute. Can you like go back about 20 seconds?
Sure. Did I begin talking about our house?
Yeah, I'm just getting a notice that my internet connection is unstable, so it may be my problem, not yours. But anyway, let's keep going and see what we can do.
We'll keep going. Yeah, so our house seemed like a gift to us. Someone from St. Augustine said, hey, the house across the street from the church is available, and it fit everything we needed. Room for the kids, room for what we needed in the house, a sunny kitchen, which was important to Megan. And there are some other things with the previous owner that he really made it easy for us to enter in. And, you know, it was to the dollar amount that the bank had pre-approved us for. And we didn't negotiate. It was just kind of like, this is your house. This is where you're going to live. So all of a sudden, I'm serving this church in the middle of the community, living across the street with the community league and the park and the schools all right close by, with this sort of thought about local living and the body of Christ local. And so that really fed in, and I felt was kind of a really good match for St. Augustine's that had been kind of doing that already or living it, even without knowing it. If you'd asked them 20 or 40 years ago, are you doing community outreach? They would have, I think, looked at you funny and said, we all live here. This is just, we're caring for the community because that's what we do.
Right.
So how that's played out a bit, they did say that one lady said, you know, there's a word that's kind of, that you've brought back to us, and it's community and our connection to what's going on. And I think that was kind of by nature of living here and our kids being connected. One of those connections, again, this is sort of from the Wendell Berry side of things and our interest in gardening. There was a community garden. I thought, oh, I should check that out, just kind of personal interest. And it turned out that they'd been meeting for about 2 years, but didn't have land yet. And I met with Sherry, who was kind of the lead, the person leading that event. And she said, yeah, we're looking for like 2 more people to fulfill the city requirements. And we're looking for a place to, sorry about Um, and I don't know how to turn that off. Um, and and so we got in conversation about that, and myself and one other person from St. Augustine's came on board with the community garden group. They were amazingly organized. I've just kind of been in awe of them. A group of neighbors would come together, love gardening, looking for a place to garden. Sherry in particular wanted to teach kids about seeds and gardening. It turned out she was a Christian, and the church that she had been a part of had just closed and was kind of looking for a church. So she actually ended up joining with the church eventually. But some very common thoughts about local living, local food production, and so it made it an easy partner for the church to connect. And we went through all the kind of negotiations and figuring the legal requirements of that. They did a whole matrix on the best, the different places they could have put the land, and it turned out that the church land was a good fit. I can pull up a photo maybe towards the end to show a picture of how that ended up looking. So in 2015, all the city requirements were met, and the church negotiations had been worked out, and we had kind of empty land sitting there on one part of our land, and so the 38 garden plots came up, and there were 150 people involved in building it, and so that's been a really interesting thing. I realized early on that it was a tremendous engagement with the community. So I know, Tim, something you've said that I've kept in mind is, if you have nowhere in your life where you're meeting with non-Christians, you need to, follow your passions and just get to know people in a very, not an, programmatic evangelistic way, but just a being together and doing things. And I realized, gosh, I don't think I've ever spoken to so many non-Christians than wandering the garden, and someone's checking things out or looking at it, and they have questions. I think of one lady in particular that's actually become a good friend. I don't think she would mind me telling a bit of her story here, that she was kind of a defunct Catholic and was had felt kind of excluded from the church, and we got talking about things and realized that we had very similar interests and passions around ecology. But I think she had a really hard time initially figuring out that I had those same passions, but I was still embedded in the institutional church. And I feel like sort of the evangelism side of that was kind of removing stones for her. And she still wouldn't call herself a Christian, but I think the fact that we're engaged in conversation is pretty huge for her, that there's someone in the church that she feels has given room for who she is. So conversations like that or other ones, and just the freedom. I found a helpful question just to begin conversation of what what do you consider as your spirituality? And because I realized pretty early on, asking someone, do you go to church? It doesn't work for a lot of people. They often receive that as kind of a judgment, or why aren't you in church? Kind of question. But I really want to find a way of like, how can I honor where that person is, and yet open a space for conversation. And for me as pastor, I actually loved, not all the time, but either being in a caller or someone saying, oh, you're part of the garden, and yeah, actually I'm the pastor here, and oh, okay.
Yeah.
These kind of moments of, oh, he's into this, but he's also into that, and how do those fit together? I just really enjoyed that chance to have those conversations.
Yeah.
So that's been a big thing, and I think we haven't had a ton of parishioners actually in the garden. There have been I think 3 or 4 of us who have been gardening members, but it's been I think a lovely chance for us to be challenged as a church of how are we making this neighborhood better? How are we being a good neighbor? How can we make space for these people to garden, which has sometimes meant hosting the potlucks. Sue Oliver said once, begin as you mean to go on. And so early on I said, I wonder if there would be space for us to do kind of a blessing of the seed at the beginning of the year, and a kind of a harvest Thanksgiving at the end of the year. I mean, we're Anglicans, that's kind of what we do, is some kind of liturgy. So I've put together a simple liturgy, often with some Aboriginal imagery kind of embedded in that, in the 4 directions and our ways of praying, and trying to create a space where we're doing this from a certain perspective. I'm a Christian, and this is what I bring. I bring the person of Jesus, and we bring our tradition of liturgy and prayer, and yet in those liturgies, making sure to have space for gratitude, for the whole community to share in that, for people's hopes, which I think is a really helpful way of getting at prayer, and yeah, trying to blend that all together. So that's certainly been a main sort of community, I want to say, presence more than outreach, because it's been sort of how do we live together, and actually kind of integrate with one another. How does the church not only talk about being good news, but actually do something that is good news? And I'm seeing our time and thinking, I could keep on going, talking about a lady who started up Simple Suppers at the church, which was involving community, an ecumenical meal that started up, that again was kind of the idea between a few churches of how can we bring together the body of Christ in service, and we had about 14 churches involved in that. It kind of slowed down over the last couple of years, and we didn't have it. We're not planning it this year, of course, and it didn't happen last year for a couple of reasons. But I think we did 5 years, and that was it felt like a really good community thing based around celebration and sharing our celebration of Christmas. And the most sort of out front thing we did, there was a retelling of the Christmas story, but I think it was just the fact of what seemed to strike both the churches and others was that churches were actually working together. We weren't in our own silos, but it was a common thing. So
there's some interesting threads, kind of, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about in terms of the Stephen Ministries Caring Evangelism program that I use sometimes, where it talks about the basic evangelizing skills, and the first 2 are building relationships and listening. And I'm thinking, as I listen to you talking about the community garden and the community presence and all of that actually the most fundamental thing is finding creative ways to build relationships with people, right? And those relationships, like when you ask people, tell me about your spirituality, you're inviting them to use words that are meaningful to them, right? And you may or may not particularly care for that phrase yourself, but it's a phrase that's meaningful for them. And so you're kind of stepping out, in a sense, into their comfort zone and letting them kind of speak in a way that's natural for them. So although we didn't sort of phrase this as a conversation about evangelism, it's interesting to me about how this community outreach, community connection, community presence, relationship building, spiritual conversation, questions can be raised, questions can be asked, and all in a friendly manner rather than a confrontational kind of manner. That's a great thing.
Yeah, and if I can just kind of add a thought that's been important to me into that, I read in a book, it was a missional book somewhere, saying, that if a church wants to serve the poor, they could preach about that for 100 sermons and nobody will blink. But if you start a feeding program and invite people to come and eat, then everyone in the community will say, that's the church that cares for the poor, or something like that, kind of based in, and I feel like that's been a core piece of like, gosh, how do people actually see us? Yeah. What when they look at the church, what do they think about us? And how could I find that out and actually get to know them? And who do I think the church is? And kind of idea of turning the church inside out, to actually show, not just say, but show. For the community garden, I think it says we're concerned about the earth and how the basic needs of food, and we're interested in people. We're interested in, as you say, these just kind of basic forming relationships and and building that, and and I think spiritual conversations often come out of that in a natural kind of way. Yeah.
Well, and if you've done the groundwork of building trusting relationships, so those conversations are way more productive in the context of trusting relationships, right? Where people feel that, and I mean, I liked what you said earlier on about the people kind of thinking, oh, this person's concerned about all these things that we're concerned about, but he's still embedded in this kind of institutional church here. So, right. So that kind of is a lovely way of maybe inviting people to revise their stereotypes of what the institutional church can be all about, right? And how it doesn't necessarily have to be all those things. And I think that's.
I love being an enigma,
Yeah.
creating a paradox that kind of invites conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, John, we're just about come to the end of our time, so thanks very much for sharing this with us. And hopefully we're gonna inspire some of our evangelists in training about some of the possibilities of ways in which people can just engage their communities and build those relationships and those bridges into the community in a genuine and loving way. So thank you for
that's great. Yeah, so glad you're doing the program, and thanks for the invitation.
All right. Okay, I'm going to bring it to an end now. Bye.
Thanks, Tim.